Going back to some of the benefits, like for me, all of the benefits that I see or read about or experience myself, they all make sense. Like it makes sense that it helps with stress and improves your mood, and there's anti-inflammatory benefits and better sleep and so on. But there is the one, and you've mentioned it, that it can help with losing weight. And somebody actually just the other day asked me, they're like, yeah, I've heard that it can help you lose weight. And I honestly didn't know the answer to why. Like, why might that be? And for me, the only explanation that I could think of in that moment was that, and this is just based on my own experience, is that practicing the Wim Hof method, breath work in general, cold exposure, it's helped me just live more healthy. Like I just want to be a healthy person. Like I want to eat cleaner. I want to get more movement in, and it's probably because I'm getting more energy from it that I now have more energy where I want to go out for longer walks and runs and just be more active. So is that maybe the case, or is there another explanation for why it may help some people lose weight?
There is, so I point to two other things, but I think that's a really nice, again, like an explanation of why. And I often call the Wim Hof method a gateway drug. Because like you said, like, oh, all of a sudden I'm feeling better, maybe I want to do more. And once I start doing more, maybe I want to fuel myself with better nutrients. And so it does start to open those doors of just sort of more awareness of what you're eating, how you're moving, how you're sleeping, the other elements of your sort of day-to-day experience. But in terms of the more, I guess, physiological or scientific mechanism, I point to two things. So we have this thermoregulatory capacity, and our body is very much driven to homeostasis, and we have our baseline body temperature where everything works at that temperature. So we have an inherent drive in our body to be at that homeostasis point. And that's controlled by the hypothalamus. So when we get cold, the body notices and we sort of induce shivering to warm up initially, okay, to bring us back to that neutral point. So if we jump in an ice bath, we drop the body temperature. Okay, you're in there for a couple of minutes, body temperature drops. How do we get our body temperature back up to homeostasis? We have to burn calories, right? That's the only way your body really knows how to generate heat. Shivering is one way. It's not very efficient. And so what we do is we start to burn through calories. So you see cellular metabolism goes up because I need to produce heat to get myself back to my physiological baseline. And then the second aspect is something that's relatively new in terms of like what they've understood about that thermoregulatory capacity is something called brown adipose tissue or brown fat. So initially when they started studying Wim, they thought like, oh, he can do all this crazy cold stuff because he's got lots of brown fat. And so brown fat is a little bit different to what we typically know as fat, which is white fat, which is a storage system. Brown fat actually produces energy or it burns calories. So babies have a lot. And until relatively recently, we thought by the age of sort of 20 to 25, adults didn't have any brown fat. We lose that as we grow up because babies can't shiver. They don't have enough muscular capacity to generate heat. So they need to have something that can heat up their body if temperatures are cold. As we get older, as we get bigger, as our muscles get bigger, we can start to produce heat from shivering. So we lose that white fat. But the reason why they thought it didn't exist is because most of us live a pretty comfortable life in terms of temperature, right? And what they started seeing and how they discovered this is they were doing, it was a completely different sort of study, but they were putting someone in a cold room and doing a body scan. And they noticed all of these little, what they thought were tumors in this scan, and they're like, oh, this guy's got all of this stuff across his sort of traps around his throat and his neck. And what they actually discovered, because it was in a cold room, his brown fat was active. And then they studied someone like Wim, and essentially the more you do cold exposure, the more we convert white fat to brown fat. So your body starts to increase its capacity to generate heat almost at will. There is techniques you can do, and Wim teaches a brown fat activation, where you can do a certain breath technique and a certain squeeze. And it's not necessarily a beginner's practice. It does take a little bit of work, but when it happens, it's pretty amazing. You just feel like ripples of heat across the shoulders. And it's like, the first time I experienced it, I was in like an ice cold shower in Scotland. And I honestly thought someone had turned the tap to warm. Like all of a sudden the freezing water hitting me, I was like, oh, like something's happened to the water system because now it's warm water hitting me. And that was just the body like turning on. And so brown fat has something called an uncoupling protein. which basically when it's triggered, it sets off this little chain reaction and just burns, and that produces heat. And to see it in action, like when you do the instructor training, you spend sort of 6 days with Wim in Poland and you do this hike. And I was walking maybe 6 feet behind him, and he is literally radiating heat. Like it's minus 15 Celsius. Everyone's wearing shorts, and I'm standing there. He's like glowing red, and I can feel heat coming off him. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, and they told this story that they did an expedition on one of the mountains, and someone like started to have a bit of a panic attack and was like, the weather turned bad, and it was getting a little bit sort of anxious. And Wim came over and sat down, and he said, just hold on a second. And they all stood around him and warmed their hands off him as he sat there doing this brown fat activation. And when I heard that before I was standing behind him, I'm like, that sounds a little bit far out. Like I couldn't really get behind it. But then standing off it, I'm like, I can actually feel like heat coming off this guy. I was like, whoa. And so he's got obviously a very, he's very able to activate that more or less at will. But it's shown that, and they've done a lot of Rhonda Patrick, who goes into a lot of sort of cold shock and thermogenesis. They've shown that sort of prolonged, or not even prolonged, but consistent exposure to cold, adults start to develop brown fat again. So it's not just that it exists in children and not in adults. It's because most adults don't expose themselves to cold. But as soon as we start doing that at a regular practice, we start to build those brown fat stores. And white fat converts to brown fat. So that weight loss can come from some of the white storage tissue being converted into brown adipose tissue.
Super interesting. I like your explanation a lot better than mine. And just saying that it makes me feel better and I have more energy. That's really good explanation. And it reminds me of the importance of getting outside of that comfort zone that we are all so familiar with, especially in today's modern world where everything is around comfort. And that's why I think there's so many benefits to things like, cold exposure and hormesis in general, is that we're stepping outside of that comfort zone to develop new mechanisms to help us live healthier and live longer. So it's super cool. In terms of breathwork, I know we've covered so much on breathwork here, but I want to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, especially the work that you're doing. Why is it important for us to learn about our breath? And for me, like, it's not just learning the technique. Once I've learned the technique, I feel like I've learned more about my body, my mind, my soul. So what is it in terms of the importance of learning about our own breath?
I think that's such an amazing insight that not everyone has initially, but like you just beautifully phrased it, the more you learn about your breath, the more you really learn about yourself, and all of those different systems. So I like to think of like awareness of breath really is awareness of self, and it's awareness of situation, because if you notice how you're breathing, then you're pretty aware of what's going on. And so I really like to think of, number one, our breath affects how we feel. So I can breathe in a certain way, it's going to change how I feel. But number two, it reflects how I feel. All right, you breathe differently when you're really anxious than you do when you're really relaxed. So it's this perfect little like window into our autonomic nervous system, right? And physiology and psychology are very intertwined. So if your physiology is a bit stressed out and out of whack, your mind is as well. Okay, and if your mind's racing with thoughts, your breath's going to be affected. So it's this like beautiful sort of system that's been developed in us that gives us a window into like, all right, well, how am I doing today? And I can look at my carbon dioxide tolerance or my breath hold capacity, or just the quality of my breath. Is it moving freely? Is it labored? Am I forcing it? Like, because that tells me a lot of things. That tells me, like, is my body happy? Have I rested well? Am I eating the right things? Is my mind in the process, or am I sort of anxious and thinking about things in the future? And the more that you can learn about these little sort of fluctuations and subtle changes in your breath, the more you start to understand like what triggers you, what makes you feel upset. And I sort of conducted this sort of N=1 experiment on myself for quite a while, where I really worked over a couple of months, just like breath awareness. Like, how am I breathing at different times of the day? How am I breathing when I do feel a certain emotion? Like if I feel stressed, like, all right, my next step is going to be, what's my breathing doing? When I feel excited, what's my breathing doing? And you start to work out all of these different patterns, okay? That then I got to the point where I would notice my breathing change before I had this conscious note of I'm feeling X, Y, or Z. And so I would feel this subtle shift in my breath, And then about a few seconds later, I'd be like, oh, I'm irritated by this email I'm writing or whatever. But whatever it was, I started to notice the breathing change before the mind. And so I was like, wow, this now gives me this, again, that little space between stimulus and response that I'm noticing my breathing change. I can change it back. I can change it to my calm breath or my excited breath or whatever it might be. And there's some pretty cool research into this, I guess, interrelationship between our respiratory patterns and our emotional states. We know now, and they did, I'll probably get the study wrong and I can't remember the authors of it, but they took a group of people initially and they told them to sort of try and experience certain emotions. So let's think of something really traumatic. And what they were doing was they were monitoring their breath. They weren't telling them that. They just said, we want you to experience, all right, feel really stressed. Think of something that stresses you out. And they'd sit there. And what the study was doing was looking at their breath patterns. Then they took a second group of people, brought them in and said, hey, can you breathe like this and tell us how you feel? And when they made the people breathe like the people felt stressed, that new cohort of people like, oh, this makes me feel a bit stressed. Let's breathe like someone that felt anxious. Oh, I feel a bit anxious. So they started to see that, again, the breath reflects how someone feels, but it also affects how someone feels. And if you don't know the difference between your stressed out breath and your relaxed breath, then there's not a lot you can do when you feel stressed or relaxed. Right? If you start to understand, all right, I know what the pattern of my breath that makes me feel really calm, or the pattern of my breath that I adopt when I'm feeling really calm, then the next time you're feeling super stressed out, you do your calm breath, all right? Because that's that signal to your nervous system, oh, if I'm breathing really calm, I must be really calm. Because it's this evolutionary sort of adaptation. You don't take a really slow, long, soft exhale when you're being chased by a tiger, all right? And so your body knows that your breath is reflective of your environment, okay? If your brain knows, shit, something's going on, we better run away, okay? Versus like, oh, my breath is silent, it's soft, my diaphragm's moving, I'm relaxed. So we can hijack that system, right? Something's making me feel really stressed and anxious, but if I can control my breath and I can make my breath tell my brain, I'm safe, it's okay, then that physiology will affect the psychology. And so it's this wonderful insight that the more you learn about your own breath, the more you learn about yourself. Like, what makes me feel X, Y, or Z?